It may seem like a distant memory at this point, but the big international news story in 2019, before COVID, was the Hong Kong protests. The protests are largely remembered today as a pro democracy, anti authoritarian government movement in response to the Chinese Communist Party tightening their grip over Hong Kong, which was largely allowed to govern itself since being returned to China from the UK in 1997. What people forget, though, is what sparked the protests in the first place, which was the murder of Hong Konger Amber Poon in Taiwan by her boyfriend Chan Tong Kai. After brutally strangling Poon to death and stuffing her in a pink suitcase, Chan then returned to Hong Kong and was unable to be extradited to Taiwan to face trial as there was no extradition treaty in place. And that's what led the extradition bill to be proposed, which would have allowed suspected criminals in Hong Kong to be extradited to other countries to face trial, including mainland China. And it was the proposal of that bill which set off the wave of protests or riots, depending on how you look at it, which eventually led to the bill being withdrawn. I say depending on how you look at it because there were two very competing media narratives. The first, generally propagated by Western media, was that the protesters were noble, freedom loving patriots peacefully standing up for democracy and human rights and being brutalized by police. The second narrative, generally propagated by Chinese media, was that the protesters were a bunch of hoodlums and delinquents destroying their own city, violently assaulting innocent people, and scapegoating China for their life problems. So, with two completely different narratives, I didn't know what to believe. So, I traveled to Hong Kong in December 2019 to see for myself. This is what I saw. I arrived on the night of New Year's Eve and saw people lined up on the street, peacefully protesting, holding up signs, and singing and chanting in unison. I did not feel uncomfortable or sense any major tension, and I noticed police on the sidelines just chilling and keeping an eye on things, not looking high strung or spiteful or anything like that. So overall, everything seemed quite civil and not like the war zone that was portrayed in the media. Then later that night, I went to join the big crowds at Victoria Harbour to celebrate the countdown to the new year. Again, there were a lot of peaceful protesters holding up signs and singing and chanting in unison. I tried to test some of them by speaking in Mandarin Chinese, as there was a lot of reported discrimination and violence towards mainland Chinese at the time, but I didn't sense any animosity towards me. It might have been my extremely broken Mandarin Chinese made it obvious I wasn't from mainland China, but still, everyone I spoke to seemed fine to talk to me in Mandarin. I did find it amusing to see Taiwanese, American, and Union Jack flags being waved by the crowd, representing all three of my nationalities, yet I was speaking the mother tongue of the country they were all protesting against. Due to fears with the protests, only silent fireworks were used that year. But ultimately, the New Year countdown went on without a hitch, and it was still nice to see the light show and fireworks, even if they were extremely toned down compared to years prior. The next day, there was a big planned protest at Victoria Park. There was nothing illegal or menacing about it. They had all the necessary permits for a lawful assembly. And from what I saw, it was all peaceful, just like the day before. Eventually, some of the protesters started marching down the street towards the city, and slowly I started seeing some small signs that things were not all rainbows and peaches. For example, you can see some anti China graffiti on the wall here, and people climbing up onto structures that normally should not have any people on them. But generally, nothing too crazy, and everything was all peaceful. That is until after sunset. Once the sun went down, that's when things started to take a dark turn. It started out as more subtle things, like hearing sirens in the distance and seeing a fire truck go by. Then there were a few head scratching moments, like during the day, the protesters mostly kept the middle of the street clear for people to walk through, but at night, I noticed some people pushing wheelbarrows full of bricks down the street. I had so many questions. Where are they getting the bricks from? Where are they taking them? Why are they covering themselves with umbrellas? I just didn't know. And generally, the crowd seemed to be more rowdy and less organized than during the day. which gave me a feeling that something bad was about to happen. Then things really took a turn when I saw a guy go up to a traffic light and just start going to town on it and smashing the lights out for no apparent reason. A bunch of people then ran up to him, and I thought they were going to pull him away and try to stop him, but instead, they surrounded him and shielded him with umbrellas, presumably to stop his vandalism from being captured by the CCTV cameras. This is the moment where I start to feel okay, these guys are not peaceful protesters anymore. They are actually behaving like vandals and rioters. I was starting to get a bit uncomfortable, but stayed in my viewpoint on the overbridge as long as I could, not participating in the protest, but just observing, until eventually the police came and cleared everyone out. It was pretty wild to see water cannons chase down protesters and hose them down, while people inside the KFC next door were just trying to enjoy their fried chicken. And that's the thing. Even though there were rampant protests, with the streets starting to feel like a war zone at night, Hong Kong was still mostly a normal functioning city, with shops and restaurants open and people going about, or trying to go about, their day to day lives. So I can empathize with locals who are just on their way to work or craving some fried chicken and then having to deal with all the protesters slash rioters getting in their way. Once the police arrived, pretty much everyone in the overbridge cleared out, and I stayed as long as I could until one of the police on the ground shined a flashlight at me, I guess letting me know he was watching me and to get down. I'm not sure if me just standing there, minding my own business, was considered illegal, but I didn't want to risk any trouble, so I made my way down to the streets, and that's where I was able to survey the extent of the damage caused by the protesters slash rioters. Here you can see random trash and barriers on a street with a fire burning in the background. Tons of bricks were scattered along the streets, and again, I'm not quite sure what they were used for. Perhaps traffic barriers or objects to be thrown at the police? As for where they came from, looks like they were dug up from the footpaths. Not quite sure what message they were trying to send, as it all seemed like pointless vandalism to me. There was plenty of vandalism done on buildings as well, including this shop, which got its glass door blown out, and this shop, which is spewing water everywhere, perhaps due to a water main being damaged by protesters. I have to say, just walking around outside, the overall sense I got was that the protesters were behaving more like rioters and just causing a lot of needless destruction and vandalism of their own city. And the police were just doing the best they could to restore law and order. Not once did I observe any police brutality or use of excessive force, and if anything, I thought the police were much more restrained than police in Western democratic countries would be in similar situations. I do recognize it's quite possible the widespread presence of media and press may have contributed to the police being much more restrained than they otherwise might have been. So as I was walking through the streets in the aftermath of the protests slash riots, I did try to test the police a bit by walking close to them. Obviously, I wasn't going to do anything crazy, like disobey this sign threatening to use force. But from my perspective, I'm not a protester. I'm just a pedestrian walking down the street, going about my business. And if there just happens to be police in my proximity, then I don't think there's anything wrong or illegal about that. There was one interesting police encounter I had. I was standing in the doorway of a building on a street that the police were clearing. I noticed as the police were making their way down the street, the local people in the area were rushing back into the buildings, essentially running and hiding from the police. They were not protesters, just residents and staff of the buildings on the street, but for whatever reason, they seemed quite scared of the police. Me, on the other hand, I just continued to stand in the doorway, and then as the police passed by, one of them started yelling at me in Cantonese, which I didn't understand, and I just pointed up as if to gesture that I live in this building, and he yelled at me again and made a motion towards me, so I turned around and went inside the building as if I was going back home. After a few minutes, I came back out, and the police had secured the street by placing barriers and stationing officers at each end and not allowing anyone to pass through. One officer, different from the one before, saw me, but unlike the previous one who yelled at me, This guy spoke to me in Mandarin in a very normal conversational voice and asked me where I was going. I said I was looking for the MTR station, and he just pointed me in the right direction. I said thanks, he said you're welcome, and off I went. So a much different attitude from the first officer and not aggressive at all. So in the end, which media narrative was correct? Was it the Western one that painted the demonstrators as peaceful protesters standing up for their rights? Or the Chinese one that painted demonstrators as out of control vandals and rioters? Well, I have to say, although the protests were largely peaceful during the day, they did become violent at night, and at no point did I observe any excessive use of force by the police. So overall, my observations aligned a bit more with the Chinese media narrative. Now, of course, I know the whole movement was extremely complex and nuanced, and just spending a couple days there doesn't mean I got the whole story. So, what do you think? Especially if you are a Hong Konger over there during the protest, let me know in the comments. Oh, and Chan, the guy who murdered his girlfriend in Taiwan and sparked the whole thing, he is still free, and Amber's family is still searching for justice. Thanks for watching. See you next time.